Well, in this video, we're going to look at Depron and, of course, modelling foam. They're much the same. Okay, this is some grey Depron here. This is white, and this is 3mm. So we're going to cover a couple of topics, and here's the topics listed down here. Okay, so we're going to look at working with the foam, cutting the foam, sanding the foam, even attaching surfaces. And so that's a list of topics we're going to cover in the video. Okay, let's get started. Well, maybe one of the first things you want to do is get your plan actually onto the Depron. Transfer the aircraft pattern. This is a body former here, so there's a couple of ways of doing it. Okay, the first way is to simply just put it on the Depron there. You can use a pin. I'm just using an anvil here, and you can actually just poke this through, and it'll make small holes in the Depron, which you can join up later. Okay, you might want to actually use a pen. If you can get enough ink into there, you can actually make some dots onto the Depron. Let's see. Okay, so we've got some dots there. So then, of course, with a pen, we can just join up those dots and just use a cutting knife. I like to use these ones with a nice sharp point, or a hobby knife, and we can cut the lines there. One important thing is to actually have very sharp blades. I'd replace the blades if you're going to do some cutting and you've been working on another project. Just use a new blade because Depron does actually blunten the blade quite a bit. Okay, so that's one way. Another way, let's do it here. Okay, another way is to use a very thick marker and just tape or pin your piece in place. And then you can just go around the edge like this. Okay, so once you take your piece off there, you'll have a nice outline, and you'll be able to just cut around that as well. Okay, another important thing is to have a really good cutting surface. So I've got this proper cutting mat here. Make sure it's nice and clean. If there's something on the mat there and you drag your knife across, it's going to leave a little bit of a dent or ruin the Depron on the back. So just make sure you've got a good cutting surface. I even use glass as well. It makes a very good smooth cutting surface. Keep the knife at a really good angle, and you'll get a nice cut like that. Okay, so that's just a couple of ways of getting the plan onto the Depron itself if you've got a plan. Well, just a bit more on cutting Depron. Of course, when you're cutting Depron, the important thing is to use a new blade. When I start a new job, I put a new blade in my my hobby knife, or this one here. Depron tends to blunten the blades quite quickly, so you better to start with a new blade. So a couple of surfaces that are good is either a cutting mat like this one, and make sure it's clean, or even using glass. I might show that a bit later. Okay, and once again, using a metal ruler. Of course, you don't want to use a wooden ruler. You'll end up with a ruler that's not straight. Okay, so just plenty of angle on the blade and drawing it through, just pressing firmly down on the bottom. Press firmly onto the ruler there to keep it flat up against the surface, and then you'll get a nice clean cut like this. Now, if you have a surface that's not really flat, let's have a look at this surface here. Okay, this surface has got lots of rough things on it, and if I try to cut on a surface that's got rough things on it, you're not going to get a good cut. Okay, so it's maybe it's a bit hard to see there, but there we go. We've got a nick there, a small nick there where the Depron is torn, and that's because you're actually running over these bumps on the surface here. So a good thing to do is use either a cutting mat or a glass surface. Let's look a little bit at control surfaces. So here we've got an elevator, okay, and the horizontal stabilizer. And of course these are not going to hinge properly because we need to cut out a gap underneath there. So we're going to look at how to cut gaps. Now whenever you're cutting, I like to use a metal ruler. If you use a wooden ruler, you're going to end up carving pieces out of the ruler, so of course use a metal ruler. Now what we have to do here is actually do an undercut. So we're going to line the ruler up very flush with the surface there. And with the knife, we're just going to not have it up straight, we're going to angle it at about 30 degrees. And remember, you don't need too much angle because you're going to have angle on both pieces, which is going to create double the angle. Okay, so we just, not straight, but a nice laid back angle, and a little bit underneath. Okay, so we just drag it back there. Now if you're using a good cutting surface, a good clean cutting surface, and a sharp knife, you'll get a nice clean cut like this. There we go. So that's the horizontal stabilizer. Now for the elevator, okay, notice this elevator is very thin. And if we put our blade on there, it's going to tip a little bit. So what we'll do is we'll just use another piece of foam to support it as well. Okay, so we can keep it nice and straight there. Get that lined up flush. Hold it down. And trim. Okay. Right, so there's the technique, and that gets us a nice little hinge there. And of course then we can use hinge tape on top. And we might have a look at that next, and join the surfaces together. Okay, so that's a technique called undercutting. Okay, so once again you're just placing the ruler on top of the piece of foam and cutting underneath. And it gives you a nice straight even cut all the way along, and that's the best way to do it. Next thing we're going to look at is attaching control surfaces. So the best way, of course you can use hinges, but the best way to do it with Depron is to use hinge tape. So this is Blenderm hinge tape. It's a medical tape. It's very sticky, and that sticks very well to the foam, and it's the best way to hinge a surface. So we'll just do a really quick example. I've got some modeling tape here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to tape down the surface onto the table. And the reason we tape it down is to keep it nice and steady, so we can keep this gap here just perfect. So we need a gap of about maybe half a millimeter for micro models, 1 millimeter for larger models. So we're going to tape them down. A little bit of tape in the middle there to stop it from popping up. Okay, so that holds it in place while we tape the surface on. A little bit more there. Okay, so I've got about a 1 millimeter gap down here. Now you could put Blenderm all the way along there. Just for example, I'm just going to show a small piece. You might just put a couple of pieces either end. So we've got our piece of Depron, model hinge tape. Now you can just lay it on like this, but if you've got big fingers, or you might just find it easier to put the Blenderm tape just on the end of a knife here. That way you can get your fingers away and just see where it's lined up. And once it's lined up, just tack it down like that. Okay, so that gives us a nice hinge surface. We might do the other end and just have a look at the end result. On the surface this big, I'd be rather inclined to put the hinge tape all the way along, but we're just doing this as an example. Okay, this yellow modeling tape is quite good. It's better than masking tape because it doesn't stick so much to the Depron. You can easily peel it out. Just peel it off without damaging the Depron. Okay, so let's have a look. So there's the hinge surface there. There we go. And you've got about a 1 mil gap. And with the cutouts there, gives plenty of room to move. Okay, so that's the basic way that we attach control surfaces. Sanding Depron's quite easy. Okay, first things first, the mask is important. Okay, you don't want to be breathing this dust in. I'm not sure if it's actually toxic, but definitely you don't want to be breathing this dust in. So first thing to do is put your mask on and you're ready to go. Okay, so let's have a look at a few things you'll need. Sanding block, you can use anything, but this is actually a proper sanding block, and just notice it's got curved corners here. Okay, that's important to have curved corners. Of course, your sandpaper, I'm using either 200 to 400 grit. If I'm doing a very large plane, maybe I'll use 180 grit sandpaper, but just find what works best for you. And we'll have a look at a few techniques for sanding. Okay, so here's a piece of an aircraft here. We need to sand an inside curve here. Okay, so it's not going to work with a square sanding block. It's going to be too hard to get into there. So what we're going to do is just wrap the sandpaper around something round, and we're going to use this to actually do the sanding in there. So just remember to keep this edge of the sandpaper away from the job. You don't want to get it caught and rip the job up. So we're just going to keep that there and just twist a little bit as we move back and forth. Okay, you can see without too much effort, we've already got a little bit of a curved surface going on there. Okay, so that's one way of doing internal corners. Okay, going to the sanding block. Now, if we're going to be sanding external corners, we wrap this around here nice and neat. Okay, this is a little bit of an internal corner, but let's do this one up here. Okay, so for the outside, you can just sand like this. Important thing to do is support the Depron underneath with your fingers. That way you won't bend the Depron and break it. A little bit of sanding here. Okay, so you can see that's put a bit of a bevel onto it. I like to put a 45-degree bevel and then go and sand it back. So increasing the angle both ways to sand it back, and that gives a nice rounded surface. But you know what, on some models, just a 45 degrees bevel looks quite nice. Okay, so once again, using the rounded parts and try to keep this end of the block well away from the job, not down here where it's going to catch and rip pieces out of the Depron. Okay, another thing you might want to do is make yourself some of these. So I've just made up some pieces of plywood here, and I've actually glued some strips of sandpaper onto them. So these are really handy if you've got a place that's hard to get to. So we want to sand this down here. Okay, so we can just go like this. It gives a nice flat sand there. Okay, these are quite handy tools that you can easily make yourself. Right, so let's have a look at sanding long surfaces. Okay, so we've got a wing here, and we want to sand a bevel along the edge. Okay, so the way you do it is this. If you're doing this outdoors, which is a good idea, so the dust blows away, you can just use the edge of a table. I'm going to use the edge of this box here. So we're going to line it up along the edge of the table or the box there, and that's going to support the Depron as we sand it and put pressure on it. So we're just going to make sure we keep this edge here well above the Depron, using long strokes, and it doesn't take much at all really. This is 6mm Depron, so there's 6mm Depron there, and you can see we've already got quite a good bevel going on. Okay, turning it over, supporting it on the edge as well. And for a larger model, I don't bother sanding this any further. A 45-degree bevel on the edge is quite good. It looks nice too. Okay, so that's a little bit about sanding. It's Depron and Modelling Foam. It's much the same. It's very easy to sand. Just work with your sandpaper. If you're not using the sanding block and you prefer to use your fingers, then you can fold it up like this and sand as you need. It's quite easy to sand down. Let's look at gluing Depron. So you need a good foam glue. Any sort of foam glue is fine. This one here is expanded polystyrene. It used to be called UHU POR, P-O-R, but now it's called UHU expanded polystyrene. It's an updated version. So this is basically, it's a contact, and a couple of ways of gluing Depron. So you've got a couple of different methods you might use. Now, if you need to do like this, you need to slot a piece into there. So you'll need the pieces to move against each other. Then in that case, you need to keep the glue wet. So you're going to put a little bit of glue on. Okay, and you might actually put it on one surface or put it on both surfaces. It really doesn't make much difference. Just put a little bit in here too. And a little bit in there. Just a very small amount. A lot of people use too much of this glue. You don't need much at all. Okay, so if the glue is wet, it's really good because you can slide the surfaces together. Okay, and there we go. I've used too much. You can see it's all coming out there. So it needs to be scraped off. Okay, so if you've got two surfaces that need to be moved as they're brought into position, then you keep the glue wet and you put the two pieces together straight away. And they need to be left a little bit longer to dry when you do this, but they'll still dry just as well. Okay, so that's one method. We've got another method where you're actually going to bring two pieces together and just put them together, and they're going to bond and stick to each other straight away. Right, so there's two methods of doing that. One method, I've got two pieces here that need to go together. So I've actually put glue onto both of these surfaces about 5 minutes ago. So these are actually tack dry. They're quite tacky and dry. So with the glue on both the surfaces, and once again a very small amount, I've actually used a scraper to scrape the excess glue off here. So once these surfaces are brought together, okay, and you press them there and they'll stick. They're not going to come apart. They're stuck instantly. So that's the advantage of letting the glue dry for maybe 5 minutes before bringing the pieces together. They stick and they bond. Okay, another method is to just put a little bit of glue on one of the surfaces, and in that case you can just sit it on the other surface and you can still move it slightly into position. Okay, so I'm just going to do a quick example here. I think you should take more time than this doing it. Do a good job, but I'm just doing this quickly. So I'm going to use a scraper. You can see how much glue we've got on that surface there. So that's actually too much, so I'm going to use a scraper. I'm just going to spread it out with a scraper. I've got some excess there, so I'm just going to put it up here. I'm just going to keep transferring the excess to the next piece that I'm working on here. Okay, making sure I'm going all the way to the corners. Okay, over there to the corner. Okay, once again I've got a bit of excess, so I'm going to put it up here. You'll get to learn how much of the glue that you need to use. Okay, a little bit there. Alright, so you can see I'm getting to the end here. I'm going to have quite a bit left over. So I'm just going to scrape it off on the block. You know, don't feel like you're wasting this glue. You know, if you've got too much on the job, don't leave it there. Scrape it off, because all it's going to do is make the plane heavier. There we go. Okay, so in this case, I could either let that dry, or I could bring it together straight away. I might let it dry for a couple of minutes if I was actually building this plane. But what we can do is we can just sit that very gently on the other piece of foam. Now, if we sit it on very gently, and don't press it down at all, we can still actually make fine adjustments. So I might want to make it flush at the bottom there. You can see I can actually move it like this. It's not stuck. Okay, once the bottom's in place, a little bit of pressure. Okay, that's set in place. Move the top and get that into the right position. Align these things. Flush here. When you're happy with it, you can push the two together. And there we go. That's bonded instantly. Okay, so that's a couple of ways of working with Depron and gluing Depron. So remember, when you've got surfaces that need to move against each other, just keep it wet and put them on straight away. You might want to put a little bit more Depron on. glue on, sorry, a little bit more glue on the Depron, just to keep it wet and just scrape the excess off. If it's two surfaces, they're just going to come together and stick straight away. Either put it on both surfaces or just put on one surface and then just apply pressure. Okay, so that's how we do gluing. Now Depron, of course, it can be bent. You can see this is 3mm Depron, so it can be bent reasonably around a surface and glued in place. But sometimes you're going to need a tighter bend. Okay, so I'm going to do an example here with 6mm Depron. Okay, so you can see it's quite thick. And what you can do is you can score it and you can bend it. And you actually half snap the Depron. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a cut here, just halfway through. Okay, it's not all the way through, just halfway through. Then we're going to use a edge of a surface again. You might want to support it like this. And just bend it down, just till you hear it crack, just a little bit. Okay, so do the next one. There we go, turn it around here. So this is actually a wing. We're putting a little bit of camber into the wing. There we go, we've got a bit of a crack there. Okay, so you can see, let's have a look underneath. You can see underneath, it hasn't actually broken underneath. It's just cracked on the top surface there. I'll get a good picture of it. So it's gone about halfway through and cracked. So this allows us to get around a fairly tight curve. Let's look at this end. We can actually bend that quite a bit and get around a pretty tight curve. Just so you have a body former here or something. And that's one method we can use to actually get the Depron to curl around the surface that's too tight. And of course, it's it'll lose a little bit of its strength, but you can always fill this gap up with maybe hot glue or something like that, or I don't know, I just leave it. Okay, so that's cutting half. It's called a half score. Just doing a half score and bending the foam. Now you can also bend Depron and have it keep its shape, but you're going to have to use heat. So for this, I'm just going to use a little bit of boiled water. Okay, so the hotter the water is, the better. Okay, this is an example. So a couple of different heat sources you can use. You can either use very hot water or a heat gun. So basically, we're just going to bend this a little bit to put it in there. And once the Depron's in there and it heats up, it can actually be bent. I'll put a little bit of a twist in this one. Okay, there we go. Alright, so I'm going to take it out. We'll just hold it in position. So of course, yeah, some people use a heat gun as well, or even a hairdryer. Anything to apply heat to it. Okay, so there we go. The Depron's now cooled down. And you can see it's retained its shape there. Okay, I can pull it out, it'll spring back into shape. Okay, so it's going to hold that shape now that it's been heated and cooled down. Okay, so using heat, there's various methods that you can use to shape your Depron. So just looking at decorating Depron, so of course we can spray paint it. This is a water-based enamel, so very importantly it needs to be water-based. If it's not water-based, the CFCs are going to eat through the foam. So using any sort of water-based enamel, you can just give it a bit of a spray. And I'll just give it some time to dry and give it a couple of coats. And so you can get something like this. And it looks, after it dries, it looks really good. So you might actually think about spray painting your parts before you glue them together. It might look really good. Alright, so here's our piece that we've spray painted using the water-based enamel. So it gives a really, really nice finish. And of course you can paint your parts after you sand them down. You can paint them before you put the plane together. Another thing that we can use is just a felt pen. So this one here is a Copic marker. It's COPIC. the brand. They're quite expensive, but they actually do a good job. And you can just basically you can just cover the airframe in. Okay, I'll just do a little bit here as an example. Okay, so there we go. You get good coverage. A little bit streaky, you can see, but still good coverage, even with the marker. So there we go. The best ways, I think, are either using the marker or even better using water-based enamel and spray painting the parts.